So a little bit of news broke recently about EA that kind of went under the radar. We all know about the latest piece of news to do with EA, to do with the fact that they are being investigated by the Belgian authorities. They are under criminal investigation at the moment for their loot box maneuvers in their video games. There was a little piece of news that came just before that. It was very overshadowed by the larger piece of news. And this little piece of news that apparently a lot of people missed, or I would assume had missed, actually has a lot of connotations. And it only got a few articles thrown out there for about a day or so. And this little piece of news that I'm about to go into detail on, it was around a couple of days before Patrick Söderlund stepped down from EA. Now, he was the second in command to Andrew Wilson, him being, of course, the big boss of EA. Now, there are a couple of theories about Patrick Söderlund basically just getting the hell out of Dodge before the Battlefield 5 disaster happens, that being awful sales. It's had a terrible run of PR, obviously, and of course the reason for that is because they're messing around with historical accuracy a little bit. I won't open that can of worms because it does tend to make the SJWs a little bit irate. My channel isn't big enough yet to be so brazenly ranty about such a subject, but then in response to those people who were kicking up a bit of a fuss, maybe showing you a little red flag in the distance that maybe you need to take a different direction in your game, instead of taking that as constructive criticism, Patrick Söderlund instead told people that if they didn't like it, then they can basically sod off. If they didn't like it, then they didn't have to buy the game. And a lot of people think that's probably what's going to happen now, and Patrick Söderlund jumped ship and got the hell out of Dodge. That's the strongest theory anyway. And it's safe to say it's pretty fun now to reel on EA for the many mistakes they've made over the past couple of years. And this little snippet of news that I keep mentioning is a new, fresh way to reel on EA that I think a lot of the EA haters out there, basically everyone, is going to appreciate as a bit of rant fuel. So tying into a kind of acknowledgement of the disaster that was Battlefront 2, EA announced that it had a newfound sense of morality. I'm not even joking. They're introducing a new moral compass policy into how they design their games, inverted commas. So on the one hand, you could say that their newfound sense of morality is supposedly a step in the right direction to ensure a fairer playing field for the gamers who buy their video games and a less cynical image of EA as a company. But really, there's no winning for them now, because it only reinforces an admission of guilt in the wake of undesirable business decisions that they've been making all this time and that will no doubt go on. So how did all this come to be? Vice President of EA Strategic Growth, called Matt Bilby, has made several statements in an interview regarding this nebulous new moral compass of EA's. He goes on to explain that we've learned a lot about Star Wars Battlefront 2. Your typical PR speak is already coming out here, leading him to work alongside Executive Vice President of Worldwide Studios of EA, the second in command, yep, it's him again, Patrick Söderlund. And the plan was to, inverted commas, redesign our game development framework and testing platforms with said moral compass. It's fairly typical of these chaps to fluff their language when handling damage control in the public eye, although there's really no way of repairing the mess that EA has made. We've all seen these broadly stated non-answers time and time before. But what astonishes me about this moral compass business is just how inherently dumb it really is. Allow yours truly to fill out the rest of this video with a good old-fashioned rant, mostly centering on the connotations of using the phrase moral compass. So if you imagine a world where Battlefront 2 exists without the uproar and the reason for that uproar, when you look at it objectively, it was a fantastically designed game. It handled wonderfully, and thanks to EA's partnership with Disney to do Star Wars games, you had a fully authentic library of sound effects and music. For the most part, moment-to-moment gameplay felt as Star Wars as it possibly could. So the hard work of Motive, DICE and Criterion is not to be blamed for the fiasco that happened. Of course, it was EA and their relentless money-fueled schemes to nickel and dime every player that really ruined all of that hard work that developers really put into making a great game. But really, the point here is to focus more on how Battlefront 2 was the tipping point after a long lineup of decisions straight up immoral to the gaming audience. And not only had EA been sneaking in greedier and greedier money-making plans for years, but they'd also given another big middle finger to the Star Wars fans. After a laundry list of developers that had worked under EA only to later be shut down, after apparently not being greedy enough to join the club, the Dead Space team Visceral got shut down. So that was another middle finger, one from each hand, facing towards an audience expecting what should have been one after the other hard-hitting Star Wars games after EA's deal with Disney, and instead the rollout of Star Wars games was next to nowhere to be seen, and the new hope that was Project Ragtag, that Visceral project, died along with Visceral. Sure, EA execs can butter up all the business rationale they like to try and soften the situation, but what matters after all of this is how it made them look to everyone else, and that is immoral, which is why we have this hilarious irony of them coming out now and saying that they have a moral compass. Well done for realizing that you have to be a human being like everyone else. It was Star Wars of all things that was being messed with, which means you're pissing off a heck of a lot of fans there, and that definitely helped with the big tip and the big pushback that we saw. But make no mistake, it could have been any other game that eventually pushed everyone over the edge. EA would push and push their monetization schemes in the wake of ever taller bar graphs, displayed at earnings meetings, dollars in their eyes, until someone finally said no. And we did. Up until that point, having a moral compass wasn't even a concept to EA top brass because it didn't need to be. Does being moral towards the consumer make us more money? No? Then bugger morality. I always like to quote Mark Hamill, so I'll do it here as well. It does unfortunately ring true for the games industry right now, and it probably will in the future as well. He said, "Careful kids, they don't care about the story, all they care about is your money." And it wasn't until the outrage caused by Battlefront 2 that they began to pay attention to the story of EA, and how all of a sudden everybody thought they could just sod off. Well, people thinking we're arseholes make us less money? Yes? Oh well, let's pretend to be nice now. EA think you're really dumb. They want your supposedly fickle love, because they're saying that now they're employing a moral compass policy in their game design. No other gaming giant like Bethesda or Ubisoft has even come close to having to say this, because it's a fairly safe bet that the people in those companies are normal human beings with moral compasses of their own in their own heads. They don't need it written down somewhere in a folder of policies to remind them not to be so incredibly anti-consumer that they don't create the gaming controversy of the year or potentially the decade. Now sure, people like Ubisoft and Bethesda, they have to be cutthroat and merciless in this crazy industry as well, but that's just how you make a successful business. EA just takes it to a whole other level, don't they? And just as a fun little analogy, you don't expect to see a big old lineup of sports cars and then that sports cars manufacturer suddenly coming out and saying to the journalists out there, we're building cars now with a moral compass. The last one that exploded and killed its passengers was actually the 1 millionth, and we've decided enough was enough. EA is basically saying exactly the same thing, but in defense of their questionable history. And you know what? It ain't gonna work, chums. It ain't gonna work. It's too little too late. In other words, EA can't possibly hope to garner good favour with the community by saying something like this. The only way they're ever going to get goodwill amongst us gamers again is in their products. The proof is in the pudding, guys, and we consumers will judge the chef based on how damn good dessert is. Make good games that don't dangle us upside down for the pennies, and do that consistently for about a decade, then maybe some of us will back down. For a company so focused on user statistics and appealing to as broad an audience as possible, they could be doing a spectacular job with PR and managing their games. Unfortunately, somewhere in the sea of statistics and pie charts and focus test groups, they lost their grip on what was most important: a happy customer.